Tax season has just ended. Can you talk about the constitutionality of all these taxes? So that'll be the last question before I go to the live chat questions. So there was great concern, discussed it a little bit, I think this Sunday, either this Sunday or last Sunday, that at the time of our founding was the power to tax is the power to destroy. There was great concern about that. And so the promise was in the Constitution, don't worry, we won't have any internal taxes, right? That will be controlled at the local and state level. We'll only tax things externally, like tariffs, on foreign goods, not on our own goods. We would never do that. Now, before long, they passed a carriage tax the Supreme Court upheld in 5 different opinions, because back then you didn't write one opinion. You had each justice wrote their own opinion, so it's kind of wacky. And so you really didn't have a binding precedent. You only had an outcome. And they came up with some bogus excuse about why the carriage tax wasn't really either. Because what the constitutional prohibition is direct taxes have to fit a certain standard. Indirect taxes have to fit a certain standard. Apportionment and uniformity. Apportionment is what's impossible to achieve, and that's a direct tax. And because apportionment requires you make all these adjustments by population and state that are just politically impossible, unachievable without massive blowback. So we didn't have, other than that carriage tax, really many federal direct taxes that could be contested or challenged until the Civil War. And that's when we imposed the first ever income tax. They removed it at the end of the Civil War so that it never met constitutional challenge. Again, they always use wars to grab power. It's always a reason to be skeptical of wars. Then at the 1890s, they passed another income tax that was struck down by the U.S. Supreme Court because they said that you can't have a direct tax without apportionment, and the income tax was a direct tax without apportionment under the Constitution. And their reason, and now it was one of the judges who dissented, said, no, the income tax is not a direct tax because it is taxing the gain severed from the source. It's taxing gain on capital, gain on labor, separate from the source. By the way, the latter has never made a lot of sense to me. How you separate out the labor from the gain. My view is that income was originally meant to be defined as taxing my profit on your labor, not your profit on your labor, because I don't think that really is your profit. You're getting equal exchange for the value of your labor. But if I say, hey, I got George, and George, I'm going to let George work for Joe, and I'm going to get 20% of the contract, then I've made gain separate from the source of the labor. But it was struck down as unconstitutional. 1913. We get through the 16th Amendment. Right? Saying, well, it's formed in 1913. Maybe you can remember. Now, there's a dispute about whether the income tax amendment actually met constitutional scrutiny, whether it passed the state legislatures in the way that it was determined by the National Archivist. Well, now the Archivist. Then it was a lower-ranking employee, I think, in the Secretary of the Treasury. But here's one of the flaws in the Constitution. Who decides what's in it? Currently, it's the Archivist of the United States. He decides whether or not. I had this discussion with Aaron Russo many years ago when he was sitting on his bed in Beverly Hills. Totally wacky. He had like all these advisors while he was on this big bed. Totally Hollywood scene. But he thought I was nuts, which was funny because he believed in far crazier things. And I explained that there was just a loophole that right now the Archivist of the United States could declare, hey, the Constitution has been amended. It declares the Archivist has all power. Right? And then you'd have a problem. You'd have a constitutional dictatorship. What would stop that? Presumably the courts would step in. But what the courts have said is that the Archivist decision is non-reviewable. That's a political question. Now, why did they do that? Because the 16th Amendment probably wasn't added to our Constitution in a manner consistent with the Constitution's requirements itself, due to changes in language, how the votes were recorded, fraud in the state legislatures, etc. But either way, that ship had sailed once the court made that determination. But the same issue of the income tax goes up to the U.S. Supreme Court in 1916. And now that judge that dissented back in the 1890s, he's still on the bench. He's the chief judge. And he says, you know what? This word income is actually limited in the 16th Amendment. It means what I, the judge, said it meant in my dissenting opinion in 1896. And so the Pollock and Bruchaber cases combine to mean that the word income has a limited definition according to what that judge said back in the 1890s. And Congress is not afforded the option to expand its definition beyond its constitutional constraint at the time of its passage. And that means gain separate from the source. Well, Congress, Congress's reaction to this because there wasn't a Revenue Act of 1913. They passed a new one after this, Revenue Act of 1916. All future revenue acts, because they don't like to call them tax acts, they call them revenue acts. Revenue acts are passed in lieu of that one all the way back to 1916. Oddly, they don't mention the one in 1913. Why? Because they changed the rules. They tried to do withholding at the source in 1913, stopped doing it in 1916. Why? Because they weren't sure it was constitutional anymore. They waited for World War II to pass a victory tax. And the victory tax is actually the withholding tax. And part of it is, and the withholding tax is not defined as what it is. Is it an income tax, property tax, estate tax? What is it? It's just a withholding tax at the source, unexplained, for which you get a credit against the income tax. People still don't know this. They think their income tax is coming out of their checks. It's not. A withholding tax is coming out of their checks, and whatever withholding tax they paid, they get a credit for against the income tax they might be due. But that's not income tax coming out of your check. It's a separate withholding tax that's never been explained. Also, during World War II, they start sending out these forms, 1040s, get people, they get mass compliance, and like, hey, this is a great gig. And they create a self-reporting, self-censoring system, self-surveillance system that allows for massive intelligence gathering disguised as income tax forms. That, and they create a lot of exemptions and loopholes and deductions, not just for their lobbyist pals and for their fellow wealthy colleagues, but also because the more exemptions and complexity they add to the returns, they not only impose a managerial class interimposition between you and the state by requiring you go to an accountant or lawyer to figure out what your own bill is for taxes, it also is the rationale for massive amounts of invasions of your privacy and mass surveillance. You rat yourself out every year. You tell people who you live with. You tell people where you live. You tell people where you go to. You tell the government, the IRS, who do I live with? Who's my significant others? Who are my children? Where do I reside? What's my all aspects of that? What do I spend money on? Which tells you a lot about someone's politics, culture, beliefs. What parties do I donate to? What church do I go to? All these things. It's a massive roadmap into your private privacy. And they love it. And that's why they continue to utilize it in precisely the form that it's currently being employed in. It's a massive surveillance technique. It's a mass control technique. Now, what does the Congress do? Congress decides to never define the word income again. That's why in the mid-2000s, a Supreme Court petition about the issue of the taxability of personal injury receipts related to a personal injury lawsuit, the beginning of the case, the lawyers say the definition of income is self-referential and circular. So that's not something tax protesters made up. That's something that well-known tax lawyers filed in the United States Supreme Court just about a decade ago. And because the word income is not taxed. Imagine if somebody came to your door and said, hey, do you owe a widget? You owe a widget tax. And you'd be like, what's a widget? Well, it's all the profit from all the widgets you made, the gross number of widgets. And from the net widgets, you owe a widget tax. Hold on a second. You still haven't defined widgets. Oh, but okay. Even that, who has to pay this tax? This is the who and the what. Who has to pay it? The liability section. The what? The definition of what it is being taxed. Historically, under the common law and constitutional construction of our own United States Constitution, it is presumed that you do not owe a tax unless it says it with specificity that you owe that tax, and you do not owe a tax unless it defines with specificity what is being taxed. Both the who and the what are mostly missing from our income tax laws. This is why they suppress the tax protester movement in America. Now, while a lot of them have gone off the rails in many places, their core complaint that the who and the what are missing from the law and under traditional common law construction and constitutional application, that means they don't have to pay the tax, is an argument well rooted in our law and our history. But it's one there ain't no federal judge that's going to listen to you for half a second articulate. And it's why they have mass criminal punishments, mass civil injunctions, mass fraud penalties and audits on those people that are involved in it. Indeed, the whole Tea Party issue with the IRS didn't start as a Tea Party issue. It started as how do they target the tax protester movement. Because of cases that I had won, they could no longer refer to them as illegal tax protesters. And they decided that the word tax protester itself made them look bad in court because of the combination of Bannister case and the Snipes case and some other cases I was part of. And so consequently, they need to redefine it, how to go after them politically. And in the process of doing that, they expanded it to the entire Tea Party movement. But that's where it all started, because what our politicians know is that tax protest is the most powerful form of protest in the history of the Western world, dating back about 8 centuries.